Chapter 3. Plum Bob could, when it set out to do so, make an impression, even upon Castle Gate. No further outbreak followed the brush with the men from Apache Cache. For the remainder of that day and all the next, the serenity of this town remained unbroken, and if the three Coloradians noted an unusual number of Doc Marble's cowboys sauntering about in groups, there was nothing in their actions to which anyone could object. Marble himself remained in town, but, probably by design, kept pretty much out of sight. Bill Block made a point of hunting up Stevens and having a drink with him, but the short-spoken ramrod stayed away from the subject of their previous talk in Las Lunas. In fact, Block revealed considerable reluctance to be pinned down to unreserved talk about much of anything. Pat would have given something to learn more about Apache Cache. He soon saw that he stood no chance, short of riding out there himself, and familiar with the retenants of Bill Block's kind, he didn't press the matter. The trio made up their mind there was nothing for them here. On the following morning they stepped into Starbuck's Emporium at an early hour with the idea of stocking up on provisions for the last leg of the trip home. The big store was doing normally brisk trade. Jake Starbuck was not in evidence at the moment, but the crusty old-timer with whom Sam had locked horns over the tobacco was waiting on trade as usual. There was little here to indicate that business had changed hands. Their wants were soon supplied, and Pat and Salone were waiting while Ezra picked up an extra box of rifle cartridges in another part of the store when their attention was attracted to a graceful girl facing the old man across the grocery counter. But Charlie, I don't understand. Her rich, low voice came across them, with an unmistakable note of troubled perplexity. Are you sure this isn't a joke? Weathered jaw thrust forward in determination, the calloused old clerk appeared strongly reluctant to acknowledge any familiarity with her. Manifestly he hated what he had to do, throwing down the list of groceries she'd handed to him in a flat rejection. Sorry, Miss Moon. No grub sold to any of them Mormons over there on Apache Cache whatsoever. Don't argue now. I can't help it. He held up a thin hand when the girl would have spoken. Them's are my orders, and I got no choice. But if it makes any difference, we're not Mormons. You know that right well. Esther Moon protested indignantly, spots of red appearing on the smooth cheeks. No, ma'am, but you live out there in the cache, and that settles it, was the uncompromised reply. Sam Salone's questioning glance coasted around to Pat's face as he listened. His eyebrows were hoisted. If they had expected the trouble with Apache Cache to simmer down and blow over, this was their answer. It was no task for either of them to guess whence the orders of this unreasonable embargo had been issued from. But there's no earthly sense or justice, Charlie Henson, in our being refused food on account of any quarrel you may have with others, the Moon Girl said stoutly. We've bought our supplies here for years, and you've never before had occasion to find fault with our money. We've nothing to do with the rest of Apache Cache, and besides, where else can we go for our needs? Well, you can always drive to Lincoln in a pinch, Henson muttered, but his look was shamefaced. Lincoln lay 140 miles away. Nonsense! This has gone on quite far enough. Why should we go anywhere else, or be required to, for that matter? Pat watched the girl closely as her swift words ran on. She looked anything but the disreputable character the aged clerk's manners implied. Skirt and polished boots were neat and tidy. Her woolen shirt was the sole concession she had made to the roughness of her environment. Brown hair clustered trimly under the pearl-gray hat, and the set of her head on the slim, straight neck said that she well knew the full meaning of pride. Anger spoke as well in the dressing down as she was given Charlie Henson. Sloane turned as a man strode in, while this was going on, to halt abruptly, taking it all in. At the first glimpse, Sam's jaw dropped slightly. Logical as it was, he had never expected to see Clay Marble here. Sam's elbow nudged Pat softly, and Stephen's glance slanted away to note young Marble, and his eyes rested there. No one else took note of the young fellow's arrival, and he stood there for a moment, tall and straight, face hardening as he comprehended what was going on. Suddenly he took a long step and ranged himself up alongside Esther Moon, his stern eye fixed on the flustered clerk. "Hold on, Henson," he said roughly. "Do I understand that you're refusing what supplies she needs to Miss Moon here?" Badgered as he had been for the last few minutes, old Charlie faced Clay, almost snarling. "That's right," he barked resolutely. "I am. And maybe you can get her help to get on that head what I'm saying." Young Marble's lean features went flat. "I see. How about you serving her on my say-so?" His words rang out. "Before I take this place apart and you along with it." "Clay, please." The girl arrested a hand on his rigid arm. "I appreciate your good intentions, but perhaps I can persuade Mr. Henson without any need to resort to violence." Clay gave her an absent glance, his fiery indignation over Charlie's cavalier treatment of her clearly uppermost in his mind. "We'll talk it over after you get your stuff, Esther," he said gruffly. "I'm not trying to be bossy. This is a store, and Henson will wait on his customers as he should, with no lip out of himself before I undertake to settle matters with Starbuck himself." It interests Pat to note that Marble and this girl apparently knew each other quite well, little as they stood on ceremony with each other now. Clay's cool championing of the girl's rights said more than mere words could have done. He was aware, however, that the range detective had arrived in Castlegate so recently that he could not have possibly have known the true state of affairs. "Well, you can jabber all your mind into," old Charlie was telling Marble with dogged stubbornness. "I got my definite instructions and I'm sticking to 'em. I can't sell nothing to them Moons, and that's flat. You go hunt up Jake Starbuck, you young whippersnapper, if you're bound and determined to, and I can promise that you're in for another surprise." Clay's thin-slinted eyes assumed a look of frosty steel. "Why, you damned old fossil!" He drew his hand back swiftly. "Wait a minute, Clay," Pat put in hastily. "It is true, you know. I don't want to see you making a mistake. The fact is, Jake Starbuck don't own this business anymore, and this fella's probably acting under orders." Marble turned abruptly, the fierce light subsiding in his glance as he recognized Pat. "Hattie, Stevens," he nodded curtly. "There does seem to be some changes around here that don't show on the surface. Can I take it for granted that there's no mistake about this?" Pat was equally short. "You sure can." Marble swung back to the scowling clerk, unmistakably purpose in his chilly manner. "All right, what objection could there be," he ground out, "to sell me a list of items I happen to want? Speak up, Henson, I ain't got all day." Charlie hesitated. He knew quite well what Clay was up to, and so did Pat, but under the altered circumstances, he felt justified to interfere no further. "Well, I wasn't given no particular directions about that," Charlie admitted. Clay reached for Esther's list and slapped it down before him firmly. "Fill that, then, and be quick about it," he directed briskly. "Clay, no!" the girl exclaimed urgently. "I'd much prefer to settle this in my own way. It's good of you, but you don't understand. This can only end by getting you in more trouble with—" He brushed her objections aside, apparently oblivious to what she had been about to add. Pulling out his purse, he stood waiting impatiently while old Charlie grumpily banged item after item down on the counter, filling the list. The transaction completed, Clay swept up the change and got his arms about the bulky box of supplies. "I suppose your wagon is outside?" He winked slyly at the girl in his dry manner. "Yes, it is. Clay, I wished you hadn't," she burst out, striving to keep from laughing at the ludicrous side of the situation forcing itself upon her. "But I'm thoroughly obliged, and I know Father will be." "How's your dad?" Clay was all interested attention. "I haven't seen him for quite a spell." Ezra had rejoined his friends, waiting in the grocery department, in time to catch the last of this. The three watched Marble and Esther Moon move out of the store side by side, and it was Pat who found food for thought in the sight. Through the store window they saw Clay lift the box into Esther's ranch rig and cover it over. They were in no evident hurry to part, and of the two, Clay appeared to have the most to say, smiling into her face with a casual ease. But Pat read into the wistful, half-sad look she bent steadily at young Marble that Esther Moon would have found plenty to reply, but for some strong restraint under which she labored. "Danged if she ain't a looker," Ezra muttered admiringly. "Seems they hide all the purty ones out in the canyons in this country." Pat was forced to admit her good looks were striking, but he privately thought that character contributed as much to the girl's handsomeness as any single feature of her pleasant face. They saw her forcing the money of her purchases into Marble's unwilling hands, and then, done, she gathered the reins and drove away. Pat and the partners emerged to the store porch as Clay turned back from the streets. "Well, Stevens?" The young fellow was smiling now, without a care in his mind. "You beat me here, it seems. One more jump on your way back to Colorado?" "Yeah, we stopped over for a day or two." Pat avoided a direct answer, without seeming to notice the omission. He grew grave and jerked his head backwards to the store. "I hope you don't mind my butting in back there. I gathered you don't savvy what's going on. The store changed hands just recently, you know." His glance was curious. "Got any idea who owns it now?" Clay shrugged. "My old man, I suppose," he responded with remarkably cool affliction. "That's what usually happens to things up in this country sooner or later." Still watching him, Pat nodded slowly. "I see. Then you know about your father. Differences with the Apache Cash, then?" Clay waved a hand in disgust. "Dad is big, Stevens. He's damn big," he stated simply. "There's no argument with that, but a man never gets so big that even petty rustling don't drive him to almost unreasonable lengths. Doc's had his eyes on that rough Apache Cash country for years, and because he's never been able to drive those Mormons out, he swears every man down there in the canyon is a rustler or worse. It's pure foolishness," he snorted angrily. "I never bothered to inquire about the Mormons themselves. They prefer being left alone, but Press Moon he's as square as a die. I'd stake everything I have on that. And what more, Dad knows it." It was Pat's chance to add to his stock of information about the cash. He did not pass it up, but asked a number of pertinent questions and listened attentively to the replies, all the more interested in Clay Marble's views since old Doc's surprising proposal that this stalwart son of his be kept under at least a partial supervision. The story of Apache Cash appeared simply enough. With their passions of obscurity free from all outside molestation, a number of Mormon families from Utah had moved down into the maze of canyons comprising the cache years before. And there they had remained, with a friendly, non-Mormon family or two, almost forgotten, under the steady expansion of the relentless frontier washing over their boundaries. Even now, they maintained a rigid isolation, appearing in town but seldomly, and for the most part ignoring the persistent appraisals and accusations that have been leveled against them. Perhaps chiefly on account of their religious beliefs. In the occasional confliction with outsiders, one and all bore the reputation of redoubtable warriors, unbending as steel, which, in fact, was contributing to the slowness with which men were inclined to provoke their enmity for whatever reason. "Looks like your dad's made up his mind to drive the Mormon trade out of Castle Gate," Pat remarked as Marble ended. He can pretty well near do it. I watched him win Elmy Saloon, the Ventation, and half the bank, besides the store, and one or two other smaller places in a poker game the other night. Clay showed no surprise, merely frowning at the news. Well, Doc goes his own gait, he said shortly. Who knows when he'll suddenly make the discovery that he's overstepping himself. There was a bitterness in the words that left little doubt of his frank antagonism to his father's bull-headed course on this range. I met him the other morning, Pat said, taking advantage of his opening. As it happens, he spoke to me about you. He's in town right now, Clay. Why not have a talk with him? Clay shielded away from the proposal with instinctual suspicion. What for? Well, he's your father, Pat shrugged, pointing out. What harm will it do to please him in such a small matter? We got nothing to say to each other, muttered the young man, reluctant to reopen relations with a parent of whom he had strongly a disapproval. Well, as to that, you don't really know what he has in his mind, Pat reasoned persuasively. I'd go along if you want, he offered. Come to think of it, Clay said suddenly, I have got something to say to him. Not that I expect a satisfactory answer, but I gotta give it a try. Might as well get it over with. Where is he? Be back in a few minutes, Pat told Sam and Ezra, rather to their disgust at being left behind. He led the way to Castle Gate Hotel with Clay at his heels. More than one alert plumbob hand watched their entrance with seeming calmness, but they weren't stopped. They found Doc Marble sitting alone in a battered hotel office, turning a dead cigar on his lips. His heavy glance bounced off his son's sternly set face before Clay had fairly set foot into the room. Well, boy, good to see ya, he rumbled, a wary eye flashing his silent thanks to Pat. Clay's opening speech was scarcely auspicious. What's this about turning down customers from Apache Cash over there at the store? He threw at his father bluntly. Is that your idea? Well, now, Doc spared uncertainly, clearing his throat. Let's not get into a ruckus before we had time to say howdy. What you been doing with yourself, anyhow? Plainly, Marble did not intend to give any direct answer to his son's question. There was a dogged look about the rancher's clamped mouth which did not escape Pat. He knew these two had last parted in anger, that Clay was ready to take up again exactly where they left off, and that, just as obviously, Doc was determined things were to go his way now. I've been riding around, Clay gestured briefly, an edge in his tone. Are you declaring war on those folks in Apache Cache? I want to know. Old Doc began to redden, his jowls swelling. Damn it, boy, don't begin heckling me, he burst out gruffly. You ain't been around for months. What do you care what happens? Clay glanced significantly at Pat. If he had made no previous reference to Doc Marble's obsession to dominate everyone around him, including his own kin, it was not needed. Clay's answer, when it came, seemed almost resigned. Just happened that I overheard Press Moon's girl being refused a handful of groceries this morning, he dropped scornfully. Do I need to say how small that looks for the biggest cattleman in New Mexico? Doc appeared about to explode in a heady wrath, but he suddenly caught himself up short. Clay, he said levelly, just what are you doing with yourself now, and I want an answer. He drove on with an effort. Did you get yourself fired again, or are you on the run after landing in some jam? There was irony in Clay's shrugging gesture. Neither one. Just at the present, I'm under contract of 3 different outfits over in the Pecos. Doc digested this, searching his face, almost pleading. 3 outfits? He accented heavily. That means either a varmint or a stray hunter, or else you're a stock detective. Is that it? Sure is, Clay agreed, meeting his eye squarely. Doc's bushy brows knit with the intensity of his thought. And what are you doing? Way up here? He barked. Steady glance from Clay did not flicker in the slightest. I can tell you that, too, he said softly. I happen to be tracing some stock that was lifted by the Billy Kid boys last month. I've a good reason to think Billy sold steers to you for next to nothing, and that you knew all the time where they came from. End of chapter 30.